So I want to thank you all for joining us. As I said, it's an important day in the calendar of many people, and so making this time is appreciated. My name is Sean Tate, and I'm the Director for the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. We're a partner with the Alliance of NGOs for Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice and Fixed South Africa in presenting this series of webinars on pursuing urban safeties towards sustainable development goals in times of extreme disruption. So I'm sure, as you can all appreciate, no sector has escaped the disruption caused by COVID-19. And as safety practitioners, which we are here gathered around, and many of us wear many different hats, are no exception. We know that schools and aftercare facilities, for example, have been closed. We know that livelihoods have been destroyed and social protections have been stalled. Vulnerability has been widely intensified and accelerated. Across the world, we've seen stark increases in gender-based violence. And we've also recorded limitations and closures around the necessary support services. The immediate future holds threats, among others, of upward spikes in the number of kind of broken homes and families, of increases in substance abuse, of high rates of unemployment, deferred education, frustrated young people who are unable to go to school and continue and kind of build their lives and careers. And we recognize that these are risk factors in our efforts to build a safe environment, against which we fear that the political demand for continued tough repressive responses will continue. We know that these risks are not solved by law enforcement alone, and a huge body of knowledge has been built up in the prevention field. And this is as important as ever. As we seek to build back better, crime, violence prevention, and safety practitioners need to be more astute. Public budgets will reduce, investment priorities might shift, and short-term political gains might be the order of the day. And it's against this that we need to continue the advocating for the importance of the developmental responses to safety that we have been working on for so many years. This series of webinars seeks to provide a platform for all of us to engage in this, be it collectively or individually. We seek to build and present an agenda to mandate holders, whether these are domestically in our country or at global forums such as the UN Crime Congress or Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which is slated to happen in March of this year, seeking our leaders to reaffirm their commitment and their investment in support of safety. Now, before we move on to the specifics of today's discussion, I'd like to invite our co-hosts, which is the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice and Fixed South Africa, to introduce themselves, and then I'll go through to the specific programs of today and to our speakers. For those that have joined early, and as the Alliance Secretariat had noted, this webinar is being recorded and it will be loaded up as soon as possible after this event. All the reports on our previous webinars, together with the program for those that are still to take place, are also available on the Alliance website, and the Secretariat will load those links into the chat window for you to be able to access. Anna, I'm going to hand over to you to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. I am Anna Lassi del Frate. I'm the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. As Sean mentioned, we are quite proud to join and Fixed Africa in this series of webinars. The Alliance is what is called an umbrella organization, an organization that puts together its members in helping them to connect with each other and in implementing the international agenda on crime prevention and criminal justice and beyond, connecting not only with each other, connecting with the UN entities, in particular the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the diplomatic community that is dealing with these topics. As Sean mentioned, we are about to get into the time for the 14th UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice that is going to take place in Kyoto in March. And the Alliance plays a coordination role in this occasion in making sure that the civil society voice is heard. And one of the objectives of this series of webinars is to have a takeaway message that we can bring to the attention of the Congress on the broad issue of global urban safety. So thank you very much, Sean. I am here as chair, but actually Tobias Krackler, who is hidden behind the A of the Secretary of the Alliance. So he is the one who is helping us to run all this. And thank you very much, Tobias. Sean, back to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to hand over to Barbara to say a few words on behalf of FLIX.
Hi, Sean, and our partners, and to everybody who's here today. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have to say, when we first conceptualized the notion of having a Change the World series of webinars, it felt as though it was an extremely ambitious task to bring people together around this feeling that what we need to do is to have significant change, not just to be adapting and using words like normal. I think we have all seen that COVID-19 has taken us into a position where many of the things that have been problematic for a very, very long time have been highlighted, accelerated, and the debates have become much more serious for us, much more urgent for us. And for me, the debate around policing and the role of police and the way in which police, we look at law enforcement and criminal justice going forward is absolutely essential to all our discussions about the potential for safety or not in our communities, in neighborhoods, in cities. And so this conversation today is particularly interesting to us. We believe in a systemic approach. We believe that nobody's mandate or function should be seen in isolation of all the others, and that in cities, this issue of identifying mandates that can be complementary but not competitive is absolutely essential. And so for me, today's discussion is one that is absolutely at the core of our overall approach as we go forward, and particularly towards the civil society response at the conference. So thanks very much, Sean, and I look forward to everybody. And I just have to say that it is so wonderful to see you, Ugi, after all these years. It's really fantastic. What a treat. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. So as we've seen from the program, today's discussion is on police and policing in a system of safety. And maybe just a few words of introduction before I introduce our speakers, and then head into the substance of today's webinar. Over the last few months, we've seen across the world that states have implemented laws and regulations to contain and curtail many rights, gatherings, etc., to try and restrict the spread of COVID-19. And this trend has been to impose on rights, to adopt a securitized approach to public health, to rely on the criminal law to penalize infringements. And this approach has resulted, among others, in a range of violations of human rights. And this is particularly impactful on those that are unable to comply with the limitations, particularly persons or for reasons of poverty or social marginalization, and they continue to bear the brunt of these restrictions. For many decades now, we as practitioners have been arguing that safety is not only won by law enforcement. Many of the risk factors that drive it safe are not something that law enforcement can resolve alone, and certainly not by relying solely on arrest, detention, and deterrence. The current pandemic shines light on these limitations and the impact of these coercive strategies on policing itself. Enforcement policing, particularly in response to these complex public health crises, constantly risks playing into the inherent inequalities in our society and be seen as being discriminatory in its nature. This places the police in an untenable situation. And as a result, across the world, we've seen people voicing their anger at repressive policing practices. And this in part has contributed to these renewed calls around defunding the police and to reinvest in social development. Now, today's discussion, we hope to explore what opportunities exist to try and reframe policing within the concept of a systemic safety and one of a mandate among many. We have 4 speakers that are going to join us to get the conversation going. I'd like to apologize for Chief Brendan Cox, who is unfortunately taken ill, not COVID, I'm happy to report, but unable to join us. His colleague, Professor Nick Croft, will join us. Professor Croft is an epidemiologist and a public health practitioner. He's been working in the field of HIV/AIDS, illicit drugs, harm reduction, and law enforcement over 30 years. And he's currently the executive director of the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association. He's also an honorary professor at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health and the Australian Institute of Police Management. And he'll be speaking to us about the role of policing and police public health partnerships in addressing these complex public health and criminal justice issues, the impact that this has, the responses, etc. And I think before we move through to the others, I'm going to hand over to Professor Croft, if you are ready, because I think that this will be a really important introductory input and framing to the conversation. As we introduce our other speakers. A reminder to ask to please put yourselves on mute when not speaking. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar, so please note down anything that you would want to ask Professor Croft. It'll help facilitate the discussions at the end when we've heard the inputs from everyone. So Professor Croft, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much for stepping in at the last moment and joining us in this discussion.
Thanks, John. I'll make some disjointed remarks and hopefully some questions can bring me to the point. Is there much background noise when I'm talking? Am I reasonably clear? Or there is?
There's a bit of static, at least from my side.
Oh, look, I'll push on and please let me know if it's disconcerting. As Sean said, I'm a public health practitioner, a medical epidemiologist. In fact, this is the most timely part of my entire life because I'm an infectious diseases epidemiologist working in relation to the role of law enforcement in public health. And clearly this is my time because this is the forefront of what we're tackling at the moment. I became interested in this issue of the role of law enforcement in achieving public health goals through my work in AIDS, and the fact that when one is working with disadvantaged populations such as drug users, sex workers, the role of police becomes incredibly important in many instances, as I'm sure you're all very aware, the police are part of the risk environment within which people who inject drugs, people who trade sex for a living have to live. And I spent a lot of my time working with in trying to implement harm reduction, HIV prevention among and from injecting drug use, sex workers and others, in trying to work with police and trying to bring police on side, because it became very apparent very early on that if the police were your ally in achieving the public health goal, then everything was possible. If the police were your enemy in trying to achieve a public health goal, then virtually nothing was possible. And that's what got me interested in, and the learning curve that I have been on since then has taken me way beyond AIDS and HIV and into all sorts of areas that I would not have envisaged. Every public health issue I can think of now, there is a role, if not critical, at least important, for partnership with law enforcement. And I won't rehearse the entire list of issues. I started a little conference in 2012 on the role of law enforcement in public health, the intersections of law enforcement and public health, thinking that there would be a few issues that in which the partnership would be important, such as violence prevention, road trauma, dealing with mental health crises. But as the conference has gone on, as time has passed, that list of issues in which the partnership is important has grown and grown and grown. And the irony, or not the irony, the paradox with all of this is that public health does not recognise this. When I say public health, I mean academic public health in particular, schools of public health, but also agencies, multilateral and bilateral agencies, WHO, downwards. They don't recognise, and I'm generalising, but generalising with a lot of evidence, they don't recognise the important role of law enforcement in public health. They recognise the role of law in public health. But there's a bit of a naive belief on the part of a lot of public health practitioners that police or law enforcement's role is simply to translate law on the books to law on the streets, and that this will happen in a sort of neutral fashion, that whatever is in the statute books will appear on the street. And I've increasingly believe anyone I meet who believes that has never spent any time on the street and has never spent any time with operational police, because I'm sure I'm talking to an audience that absolutely understands this is not the way the world works. There is not a school of public health, Master of Public Health course in the world that teaches about the role of law enforcement in public health. And I find this extraordinary. There are very simple issues, very simple public health issues where the role of law enforcement is inescapable. And I have the pride in coming from the jurisdiction in the world that had the first compulsory seatbelt and compulsory motorcycle helmet legislation in the world. And the role of police in enforcing that legislation has simply one point, and that is public health. So the Global Law Enforcement Public Health Association, through its activities, including the international conference, is really aimed not at policing, not at police reform, but at trying to get public health to recognise the need to incorporate police as public health actors, not just police, other aspects of law enforcement, the law enforcement sector as well, public prosecutors and so on, but particularly police, as public health actors. And to include policing as public health actors would shed light on issues such as the police response to the COVID-19 epidemic. Again, as I'm sure I'm not telling anyone anything, but some of the excesses that we've seen with police responses, police enforcement of lockdown and curfew laws, to the point of killing people to enforce those laws, make absolutely no sense in public health terms. But then the police aren't seeing themselves as public health actors, and the police have not been included by the public health world as partners in the public health endeavour. In terms of the future of policing, I see it as a question of trying to find common ground between those of us in all the different sectors involved in trying to promote community safety and well-being. We've grown into silos. There's a law enforcement silo, there's a public health silo. Trying to find common ground, and each is distinguished by different language, different culture. Trying to find common ground, I think, is so that we can be complementary partners. I don't think in terms of defunding the police, I don't think there is a place for abolishing police at all. I think police are a very necessary, and law enforcement generally is a very necessary aspect of society. But I do think that they need to be included in the broader goals, as partners in the broader goals that we're trying to achieve. I think that one of the things that we're discovering in working between public health and law enforcement is that if we can move away from language of crime and illness to look at a language of harm, and how we're all engaged in the process of trying to diminish, prevent and decrease harm, then I think we start to find some common ground. Sean, I'm not sure how long you wanted me to talk for, or how long Brendan was going to, but that's some introductory remarks. If I can leave it there, and people can come back to me if they want to.
Thank you very much, Professor Croft, for pointing us with what we would like to impact in the or unpack in the discussion. It is certainly provided food for thought. Akinyoda on the spot, I think it would be appropriate to shift from this study. Kemi is Executive Director of Partners West Africa in Nigeria program, and she's the lead on the Nigerian policing reform program. I've asked her to on the policing situation in Nigeria in regard to the current situation. As we might know, many of you might know, that Nigeria has just brought in a new police act, and this is something that has been kind of required for a very long time. The previous police act dated back to, it's a massive achievement, but at the same time, it happens in this context where we've seen police responding and being to manage the restrictions and this demand placed on them. And in this environment, and building up on a legacy of a number of other challenges of vociferous protest against policing and the establishment of commissions of inquiry across all Nigerian states, processes being undertaken by the Nigerian Human Rights Commission to unpack, understand, and devise a way forward in what is truly a crisis situation for policing in Nigeria. And I think it's going to kind of bring us into the reality of this context before we move ahead and look at some of the more framing discussions around how to move forward. So Kemi, thank you very much for making time. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment. I hope I haven't taken you off track with my rather long introductory remarks, but I'm going to hand over to you, and I look forward to your inputs. Thank you very much. I think you might just have to unmute yourself, Kemi.
I forgot to unmute. Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. Like Sean said, we recently just passed, we just recently got police presidential assent to our police, to the new Police Act, which had been in the pipeline since 2004, that the work on the review of the Police Act started. And 3 points I would emphasize on for the purpose of this discussion. The first one is community policing. The second one is hinged on independent complaints reporting mechanism. And then the last one would look at the coordination between policing providers and social development structures. So first on community policing, with the new act in place, we are able to institutionalize or have a legal framework for community policing in the country. And this is particularly provided for in sections 113 to section 119 of the Act. A lot of effort and resources have gone into introducing and reintroducing community policing into the Nigerian police and policing system. It was initially launched in 2014. It was relaunched in 2017. And I think recently last year, there has been an allocation of about 13 billion naira. I'm not sure what my conversion rate is. If Sean can quickly do that for me, I think that would be at the rate, black market rate of about 470 naira to a dollar, as funding for takeoff of the community policing program in 2020. Yes, we believe that it can reduce tension, and it could also provide some support to reduction of crime. Above all, is looking at it as a way of building trust between the citizens and the community. But then the question we ask ourselves is, what would this model look like? What would the community policing structure look like in country? And that's because you have various players in the field beyond the formal agencies of the Security and Law Enforcement Agency. For those that know us on this side of the climate, you know that our traditional law enforcement or policing structures are strong, and they have direct access to the citizens, and the citizens before we used to say urban poor and rural area would have this informal policing apparatus or schemes that help them police the environment. But I beg to say that it's gone beyond the urban poor and rural area. You can also see some form of this informal policing structures in the cities, but maybe better structured or better regulated, or they wear nice uniforms compared to those in the urban slum areas and the rural areas. So there has been discussion around what would this structure look like? How would we come up with a workable model of community policing that would address all the issues? Then with the NSAS protests, it further creates the divide between police and the members of the public, particularly with the youth. So the question is, if the police are going to be part of the community, of course, the police naturally have to be part of the community policing structure. Do you use solely the police, or is there a space for these hybrid groups or non-state actors, informal actors, and let it be more of a multifaceted approach so that we look at something that addresses and speaks to everyone? Then when we look at the independent reporting mechanism, because we all know that human rights violations and then the way and manner in which complaints are treated is something that is at the heart of also mistrust between the police and the members of the public. There is provisions for it within the new Police Act, with the attempt to set up a unit that will look at independent reporting mechanisms for citizens to report human rights violations. I should quickly say that just coming from a meeting that is looking at reviewing the police regulations, and one of the aspects of the regulations is also looking at independent complaints mechanisms, because you're asking yourself, with the mechanisms within the police itself, can the police honestly collect complaints, look at its complaints itself and address it, and be sure that they would be giving you concrete, transparent, independent, unbiased feedback? The COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with the NSAS, I think has also amplified this mistrust and the challenges that the police have with citizens. The panels of inquiries are going on. The complaints and the petitions that are before the panels of inquiries, we had a bit of discussion around that, and it's mind-boggling. Some of them are hinged on ethics, professional ethics and conduct that one would expect ought not to happen in the first place. But then they have happened, and what steps have been taken. And you are having, I think at the national level, there are over 300 cases that the National Human Rights Commission is addressing for the judicial panel. And that is outside Lagos, that is outside some of the other states that have set up their own panel of inquiry. What we are hoping is that from the Police Act, that if this act is properly implemented, that the unit that's going to be set up would receive a complaint of information of police officers' misconduct directly from the public or from other police officers or of authorities, showing that the police is involved in an act that is hinged on professional misconduct, complaints that has resulted in death or serious injury or any other gross human rights violation. How this would work with other mechanisms like the Police Service Commission, even the National Human Rights Commission itself, is yet to play out. And these are some of the things that we discussed today, that how do we set up an architecture that allows us to pull together other agencies that already have mandates without trying to also looking at good practices, so that we're not just putting something together that looks nice on paper, but something that is workable and something that is practicable and accessible to members of the public. There's a lot of talk about IT infusing ICT or technology into some of the operations of the complaint mechanisms. But then the question again, some of us we flag is, yes, ICT is good, but how do we take cognizance of the urban poor and the rural community? Because they are also part of the population. Do they have access to all these new technologies that we easily have, we have access to in the city? And how are we able to deploy it? Finally, looking at coordination between the policing providers and social development structures, the issues around the high rate of sexual gender-based violence during the lockdown. Over here, we saw it, that the rates of complaints of sexual gender-based violence increased during the lockdown. In fact, some of us working within civil society say that even when the structure was being set up for response to the pandemic, sexual gender-based violence was not seen as an emergency situation that was envisaged. So there was no mechanism for addressing it, and there was a directive, and it's not the fault of the police. I think it's also the way we were all thinking, that complaints, trivial complaints, let's just put it like that, shouldn't be brought to the police station. So citizens were advised not to come to the police station, and that only serious issues should be brought to the police station. And of course, when you say serious issues, you're talking about armed robbery, you're talking about murder, blah, blah, blah. So even those providing, for those that were in the front line of providing response to victims of sexual gender-based violence, were hampered by the process or the procedure of the lockdown. They couldn't move and needed to be negotiating access and approval and permission to move, to be able to respond to victims. And that brought us to the forefront of frontline responders. Now, how do you define frontline responders? And because the issues we deal with are multifaceted, it is become obvious that the police and social development workers or structures need to work closely together. And to build these linkages, you needed to have some people feel it should sit on the table of the Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development to be that coordinating agency, also because the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan gives them some form of mandate to look at issues relating to gender-based violence across all institutions. But then the question you ask is, do they have the convening power to be able to bring the law enforcement and security agencies onto the table? This is still something that, I mean, we're still asking how this would work out. Areas we say that for this to work effectively, that yes, we do agree within P1 that the criminal justice sector cannot continue to work in silos. It needs to be seen as a broader part of a social system. and see how they can work within the social system and address some of the issues, including the public health issues that we're talking about here today. And then when that is done, definitely we would see advantages and natural gains on some of the work advocacy that civil society have been on for years. For example, gender mainstreaming. Two would be data collection and the structure of analyzing data across SPARE and the implication of data analysis to different parts of our work. And then finally, it's the modernization of the criminal justice system. Thank you very much.
Very much, Kemi. Again, I think you're going to have a lot of questions and comments on that input when we get to that section. I'm going to hand over to Ambassador Zvedik. We have become very used to referring to you by your first name, Ugi, who will take us through some of his recent work around the Sustainable Development Goals and what this means for policing. As we've seen with the Sustainable Development Goals, development and access to justice, particularly when we look at Goal 16, but also some of the other safety goals that we see in Goal 11 and others, has really brought policing into this environment to an extent that it has never been before, and certainly not with the Millennium Development Goals. What does this mean in terms of how policing needs to rethink its role within this global agenda, and how do we start measuring and tracking that, and how do we bring that into this conversation? So Ugi, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Ugi is head of the Permanent Observer Office for the European Public Law Organization to the United Nations. He's also a senior advisor to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and he's an adjunct professor at the School of Government at LUISS University in Rome, Italy. So Ugi, thank you very much for making the time to join us. I think also just unmute yourself as well. And you do have a presentation, so this will be shared as well on the screens.
Okay, sorry, thank you very much, Sean, for the introduction, and I would like to thank you, Barbara, and Nan, for inviting me to participate here. My talk will be a little bit different from my two distinguished colleagues before me, in a sense that I will try to present just a moment, since I have to make it okay. I will what I would like to do is actually to respond to the main theme of your webinar, and that's the Change the World, by talking about policing and the Sustainable Development Goals, in a sense that Sustainable Development Goals are actually to improve the world. So in that sense, also to change the world. And of course, you are all aware with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, but actually 16 are more operational, and what we have to note from the very beginning is that policing or police, law enforcement, is not explicitly mentioned in Sustainable Development Goals. Rather, a very wide category of criminal justice is referenced in these. Yet a more thorough reading of Sustainable Development Goals talks about police and law enforcement. It calls in preamble for human rights-oriented police, the style of policing that is protecting vulnerables, etc., etc. So about 2 years ago, together with Professor Lovrich and John Seller, I did a small book on policing for Sustainable Development Goals, and this is mainly from that book that what I wanted to say. There is something very interesting that happened after the Sustainable Goals were adopted, and that is that a number of organizations, including within the UN, but also NGOs, and we will see Interpol as well, tried to show that their mandate actually can be found in a number of goals in Sustainable Development Goals. And I found it sometimes a little bit exaggerated, but it was this temptation actually to show, yes, we are there and we can, with our work, contribute to the fulfilling of these goals. These, for us, I think, and for policing as a topic, it is goal 16 that is the most important one. But obviously, there are also, for example, in goal 3, which deals with health, there is a mention of drug abuse prevention. Goal 19, innovation in innovative technologies. Goal 11 about urban, so crime management in expanding urban space and migration. Goal 14, goal 15 about ecosystems. So yes, policing can be found there, but still, I think that the most relevant goal is 16, and that is to promote peace, inclusive societies, access to justice, and I would like to emphasize this, to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. This goal has 12 targets. And for example, if we look at target 16.3, that is promote rule of law and ensure equal access to justice, the indicator that is used to measure the achievement of these target is proportion of victims of violence in the previous 12 months who reported their victimization to competent authorities. Competent authorities, for all of us, actually, most of the time, this is police, because, you know, these are violent crimes. It's quite logical and normal that it is the competent authority. So, although not mentioned as such, a very important indicator of one of the very important targets of goal 16 is police. So it is there, though not explicitly mentioned. And actually, this is a very classical indicator of access to and trust in police. And this is very good because we can use this measure to see the development of policing. Or if we look at target 16.5, which is to substantially reduce corruption and bribery, again, indicator, there are two indicators. One is for citizens and another one for business, but they are the same, basically. And that is proportion of persons who had at least once come into contact with public officials and who paid the bribe to a public official, or were asked for a bribe for those public officials. This is another classical indicator of bribery, particularly for police. And in most of the surveys, research, you will find reference to police for bribery. Among other things, that is also one of the reasons why we have police standing very highly on any corruption indices, because it is mostly or more often than other public institutions used to measure bribery and corruption. So again, though not explicitly mentioned, police is there, now linked to corruption and bribery. And I would like to point out what I think for me is very important, and that is target 16.6, which talks about effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. And the indicator to measure this target is proportion of population satisfied with their last experience of public service. Again, this is another classical indicator used in all victimization or police satisfaction surveys. And we have plenty, or relatively more data about police and satisfaction with police than with a number of other institutions that population or citizens get in touch with. And I think this is very important for me. Somehow the whole goal 16, the trust of it, I find it is to promote effective, accountable, and transparent public institutions, because it is through their work that a number of these goals, including 16, but also many others, can be reached. There is, of course, target 16.4 about illicit financial and arms flows, organized crime in all forms. And again, indicator is proportion of seized, found or surrendered arms whose illicit origin or concept has been traced or established by the competent authority. And again, competent authority in this case, most of the time, most often, is police. So again, we have an indicator, typical police measurement indicator that is used to measure a target without explicit mention of police. This is just a graphical presentation of what Interpol, as the global policing organization, did, and that is that it has set 7 goals last year, actually, and which are terrorism, border integrity, vulnerable communities, global integrity, curbing illicit markets, secure cyberspace, environmental security and sustainability. And Interpol, as many others, try to show how its own goals are linked to the sustainable development goals. So that you see the terrorism is linked with goal 9, 11, 16, and 17, and so on and so forth. And many other organizations have been involved in these exercises of trying to either match or adjust their own mission, their own goals, strategies to sustainable development goals. And that is because indeed, sustainable development goals are the most comprehensive set of world values and instruments for this century. And it is actually modern affirmation and modern operationalization of the UN Charter. And there, though not explicitly mentioned, police or policing plays a very, very important mode. And it also tells us, as we have also heard from our 2 previous colleagues, that there are ever-changing modes of criminal governance in a space that policing is not anymore only about keeping the order or running after the real criminals. It has many other functions, actually, and these other functions are often much more important in terms of appreciating the police work than catching the criminals, to use that phrase. And anyway, modern policing must contribute to and benefit from the positioning of with respect to the sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input. I think if we are looking for leverage points and access points in terms of encouraging a more developmental response from police, then certainly this provides us with some of those tools. And it's interesting to see those links and how the police have been kind of particularly mindful to try and kind of cast themselves within that SDG light. Professor de Grief has joined us. I'm going to hand over to him, who will be our final speaker before we open up for discussions. So Professor de Grief is a senior fellow and prevention project director at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School. He's also the past rapporteur in a group of experts on prevention appointed by the Human Rights Council in 2019. And I've asked Professor de Grief to join us because of a fascinating piece of work that he's embarking on, which is around the development of cohesive and substantive prevention efforts at an international level, and whether human rights as a framework can be used for prevention and offer not only redress but also critical protective mechanisms and measures. And in this way, human rights might resolve some of the problems that we see, and we certainly have been examples that have been used this afternoon before they arise, and provide that framework for greater introduction. Before I say anything more, Professor de Grief, thank you very much for making the time, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and my apologies for joining the meeting late. I should also say that I feel that the invitation, although very generous, is unmerited in the sense that I do not consider myself a policing expert. I talk to you in this context as someone who has done about 25 years of work in the sphere of transitional justice, in the course of which I approached questions having to do with the integrity of security forces, including the police, from a human rights standpoint. But I have very little expertise in the details of policing strategies, for example, or in the shifting models of policing. That has begun to change, and as Sean just mentioned, this may be the reason why, despite my lack of expertise in this topic, as opposed to the rest of the members of the audience, and of course the distinguished panelists, for two reasons. I had the very big pleasure to participate in the Pathfinders project having to do with the development of policies around SDG 16 plus, and therefore I concur completely with the comments that have been made, that were made by the previous speaker. But most importantly, as Sean mentioned, I have proposed for a long time, since I was a UN Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, a refocusing of the discussions of prevention of massive human rights abuses within the United Nations. And I have proposed this refocusing for several reasons. At the broadest level of generality, I think that human rights discourse, with the contribution of human rights activists, of which I consider myself a part, this is the world that I come from. The human rights discourse has adopted an exclusively backward-looking character that I do not think serves its cause very well. We, of course, have emphasized the redress exposed function of human rights, but have left underattended the ex-ante prevention, problem-solving nature of human rights. And I think that that goes partly to explain why particularly governments have become generally suspicious and generally unsympathetic to human rights discourse. There's nothing in the nature of human rights that determines that this should be so. I happen to think that human rights is a problem-solving instrument, that in many ways it is one of the best anti-grievance mechanisms that we have, and therefore that their ex-ante preventive function needs to be taken advantage of. Part of the project that Sean has been kind enough to mention involves, and this is goes hand in hand with the shift in focus of the prevention discourse that I hope we can achieve, is that most of the discussions at the international level have tended to concentrate a lot of attention on the role of the international community in prevention via initiatives like diplomatic good efforts. And of course, it's not that I think that diplomatic good efforts are insignificant, but that the brunt of the preventive work takes place at the national level through nationally led initiatives, and usually at the point of contact between state authorities and citizens. And for the ordinary citizen, those points of contact include the educational system, the health system, basic infrastructure, but also, and relevantly for this discussion, policing. This is where citizens usually meet state institutions. And therefore, I have always felt, and of course, speaking to you from the United States, from New York, you can imagine how in the recent past I have been thinking about the significance of strategies for policing, even in a country that otherwise thought of itself as strongly institutionalized. How you can get policing either very right or very wrong, depending on the relationships that you develop with the community. And therefore, I have included in this big project as one of the basic work streams two initiatives having to do with security, one having to do with the study of policing strategies. It seems to me that there are many countries in the world in which stronger relationships between the police force and the community, greater familiarity, a different understanding of the role, less in terms of enforcement and more in terms of support, has been a very successful means for the prevention of abuses by the authorities. The second element in this security workstream has to do with civilian oversight mechanisms over the security forces in general, particularly the intelligence services and the military, on the premise that that covers a significant part of national budgets that are typically shrouded in some degree of secrecy. We have granted a monopoly over them to non-civilians, and if we aspire to full state authority, we need greater and more effective civilian oversight of this. And the final point that I will make about this, I think, and this is perhaps something that we can discuss in the next period, what I think is absolutely fundamental is not to think about this as completely isolated initiatives, but rather as part of a comprehensive policy. In other words, it is very difficult to achieve success in the area of security, including police, without at the same time achieving some progress in related areas, such as legal and constitutional reform, but also in the spheres of both strengthening of civil society and the spheres of uh, personal dispositions and a certain attitude towards, for example, a culture of citizenship. I think that these things go hand in hand, and I am very interested in discussing what is the relationship between policing effectiveness, policing attitudes on the one hand, and other institutional and cultural changes in the other. I think that I will stop here because I should not, as a non-expert, I don't think that I should take more of your time, but I just wanted to pose the significance of the topic within discussions of prevention and the significance of the linkages between policing on the one hand and broader, both structural and cultural reforms on the other. And with that, I will stop, thanking the organizers again for the very kind invitation. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you so much, Professor de Kreef. I think it provides a really great bookend to the opening inputs made by Professor Crofts, raising that question around why public health practitioners don't see the importance of the role of the police and vice versa, and how to build that complementarity and comprehensiveness in our response going forward. Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to ask one of my colleagues, Professor Rainuka Daga, who is the Executive Secretary for the Afro-Asian Association for Justice Development, to reflect on some of the events that have happened in India. Again, we've seen a really particular response and a very kind of repressive response to the management of C19 and the transmissions and the impact that this has had, and the prospects going forward in terms of looking at a more holistic and more preventative response. I know she's under pressure, so I've asked her just to come in here for a few minutes, and she'll probably leave us afterwards, but I think it'll be a useful intervention. Professor Daga, thank you very much. I think you're still on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to engage in a very useful conversation with this platform. I'm very happy to share what's happening in India, to get the Indian perspective also as part, or the Indian context as part of the ongoing discussions. I think two things I'll just say briefly. First is, I think the police as a frontline worker has evolved. They have evolved within the COVID trajectory. So initially, when you had the lockdowns, of course, there was force and there was use of control to make sure the population stay indoors. But since the police was one of the very few people, very few institutions that were on the roads, that were out were able to be moving around, they were mobile and they had their resources with them. They were also performing many of the essential services which other departments and services could not. So you had, if people had died, they were taking them, they were conducting all the ceremonies and cremating people. When the migrants, huge force, they were about more than, I think, about 10 million labor migrants moving from the urban area to the rural areas. Eventually, it was the police stations that became the hub of the controls, and even the public was going to the police stations to see which trains, which bus stops, or how can they move into the interiors. So they were also providing all the protection to the health workers, because the health workers were being targeted by the community, who couldn't understand why people are coming in for these checks. So there were a lot of functions that the police was performing that was not part of their mandate, and they did win some trust among the people. There was also sympathy for the police, because there were incidents where, like in Punjab, one policeman's hand got chopped off because he was asking people to stay indoors, and there were a group of people wanting to go shopping. So that was the initial stages, and then we found that there was business as usual. But the other issue that I wanted to bring about and discuss here was how policing and protest movements can be, what are the issues that protest movements would raise for policing, especially in urban context, which is the scope of today's discussions, because many of these protest movements are around the seat of power, which is the urban areas, which what we are seeing what's happening in Delhi, India's capital, where we have a huge farmers' protests. I believe they're about anything around 200 to 300,000 farmers parked there. Today is the 56th day of protest. So they have just surrounded Delhi, and they're protesting for farm rights. I like to base these observations, of course, in part of what we've been discussing throughout the day, that there needs to be a systemic response. Policing is part of a continuum of governance, and also in the post-colonial reality in where many of our societies are based. And we do know that the global dynamics and the nature of the state is such, which has brought about now many of these protests. What these protests are against the agriculture versus the let's say the corporates, where the agriculture, the peasant community is feeling threatened that they will no longer have a livelihood. The issues that I just wanted to raise was that these are huge populations, mobile populations, and it's not just a reaction. It's not part of the COVID-19. We've had many of these protest movements where women were protesting in sit-ins and having lockouts when they wanted alcohol, when they wanted a prohibition imposed. You had around 300,000-400,000 people down in urban areas, where in a particular urban city where they wanted where the court verdict against a religious sect was to be heard. And how does the police cope within these huge hundreds and thousands of people who come and take away all the parks and the roads? So there's no sanitation, there are no normal arrangements, and these are very volatile situations, because you can have you can have any kind of violence erupting. In fact, in one of these, there were last year, just a year before COVID, there were 36 people who got shot because they broke the barriers when they were protesting against protection for their religious head. So these are huge populations. You have places given in the urban areas where you can protest, but they're for limited people. Now, the issues that come to my mind are, firstly, the police, these people are protesting against the government. They are not protesting. The police is only performing a regulatory function. There is no crime. They are just performing a regulatory function of law and order and preventing any chaos to taking place. But the people are very clear, at least in these protests, that they are wanting the state. They are in conversation with the negotiation with the government to change the laws, but there are also huge numbers protesting outside the capital. How do you manage them? And they are saying on 26th January, which is our Republic Day, they're going to be taking out a parallel convoy of tractor rallies. And now the police is also in talks with them so that there is no violence, eruption of violence. But my question is that when the role of the police is only a regulatory, they are not there, they cannot resolve any of these issues, how can we have community policing, or how can we build trust, and how can we build respectful policing when the police is the first force to control and to disarm and to disrupt these protesters? So you're not going to be, and even the police used water cannons, tear gas, they were backing charges when they did not want these protesters to come to the gates of Delhi. But then the political leadership took a step back and allowed them to park themselves here and have these negotiations. So you have a situation where the constitutional rights are being vied for as against, the public inconveniences or situations of a riot or huge violence erupting, and it's not the mandate of the police to handle this. So how do we move across this? How do we move into an area where police, what kind of conversations can take place? So that was some of the things that were coming to my mind, that it's not the mandate of the police to manage these populations, yet the police is asked to look into it. And on a positive note, I just wanted to say that many of the women protesters are in here in huge numbers, and there is a strategic gender movement where the farmers are taking the women and children so that they can be a barricade, and they can't, so that they are a protection against the police. And the government also knows that they cannot have a force out against women and children. So here you find that women are being given a stage, they are talking, they are managing the farms at the back in their homes when their husbands and family members are out protesting. So you're finding a huge a fillip to the gender movement. And I won't take too much time on that and on what's happening. I can talk a lot on some of these fascinating developments. But the question to me was that how can when you have a police, when the population, the citizens are against the are wanting certain constitutional provisions to safeguard their rights, and the police is just a barricade for them and will violate their rights. So how can you have community policing or build trust or relationships in these contexts? Thank you.
Thank you, Stranuka. And it's good to have you in perspective. I mean, the developments there have been so unprecedented, particularly with the mass migration into the rural areas in those early days, and the impact and the legacy that has. I think your final question speaks to the heart of this. I mean, if we are going to look at restrictive law enforcement, regulatory responses to all of these crises, we're going to be butting heads, and you know, we're going to come up against each other. There need to be creative alternatives, and it's found in the mandates of the many that contribute towards making a safe, livable space. I'm going to open up the meeting for questions. If you hover over your name, you would be able to raise your hand. There are also questions that have been posted in the chat, and I'll try and navigate that as much as possible. But any questions of clarity to any of the speakers to start off first? And then I think if we can then double back on some of the key questions for this webinar. Do we need to re-establish commitment from our governments and our international community to the importance of these prevention practices? And how do we overcome some of those challenges that have been with us for so long? We try and advocate for prevention. An issue that I think is going to become more difficult and complex within this new reality, and as people grapple for what I fear would be the shorter term solutions to some of these crises. I've said my piece. Any questions or any comments from our previous speakers, having listened to our fellow speakers, anything that you would like to come back on and explore in a bit more detail or raise? I see a hand from Dr. Thomas Probert. He is Research Director at Freedom from Violence at the University of Pretoria and the University of Cambridge. Thomas, you have the floor. I'm not going to be able to introduce everyone like that, so I think I must add the caveat that please introduce yourselves and put on the camera when you ask the question. Thomas?
Thanks. Sorry, I'm going to have to run in 10 minutes, so I apologize for asking a question and not necessarily being able to listen to the full answer, but I'll catch up via YouTube. Thank you very much, Yugi, for the presentation on the nexus between policing and the SDGs. I'm I very much agree with the idea of thinking about the full range of implications, indicators for policing, both in terms of justice and in terms of their effectiveness as an institution. I think there's a lot of possibility there. But I think two questions, one question and a comment. We need to think about who's collecting and how, and what kind of responsibilities we as a group of stakeholders have for collecting data that can contribute to those indicators in a useful way, and then secondly, not to lose sight of the safety indicators as well. I mean, you focused on the justice and the institutional indicators, but in terms of safety, obviously there's information that the police are responsible for collecting, crime data and that kind of thing, but also data around how safe people feel in communities. And I wonder how that might feed into having a constructive conversation around performance indicators for the police, and whether that could be taken further. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Any other questions? I have one posed in the chat by Tuluma that the example of the police officer who lost his hand during the lockdown, and the fact of whether there was compensation in such instances, and in terms of developing that relationship between the police and the community post that incident, were there restorative processes or punitive measures against the perpetrators? I don't know, Ranuka, if you are able to answer that. I know you also have pressures on your time. Ranuka, are you still with us?
Hi, I'm there. Sean, I was typing, but I think it'll be better to answer. Yes, there was a lot of support for the policeman who lost his arm. There was a lot of media coverage, and he was taken in quickly to repair his hand, and fortunately he didn't lose his hand. And this was used as a platform to build more strength and partnerships, or trust among the police and the community. So I think what your question raises, a rather important issue, is that these things move hand in hand. You have a trust, you have a support of the police. You think the police comes and helps out in difficult situations, but also that the police is at many times infringing on your rights. So there is no black and white situation as such, but there is this kind of a feeling that the police is now has more and more control and regulation given the kind of context we are facing. And I think much of the goodwill that was earned is eroding in these times today, especially in areas of Punjab where these protest movements come from. So we need to look for much broader answers of cultural, social, and also political transformation. And I think the earlier conversation we had, that how can we define, if we use harm as an area to pull in together all the different perspectives, I think that could work, because that would cover health, gender, even violence, and conflict and peace building. So I think that would be a good area to start and see how we can continue to build for protective communities where harm is one of the variables of moving forward. Thank you.
Professor de Vree, if I see you have your hand up, sorry about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment about the sort of links that were brought up by Rainuka's intervention. That in a context in which trust in state institutions is declining, or even in contexts in which trust has never been there, it seems to me particularly difficult, the role that the police forces are often put in seems to me particularly difficult to satisfy in a way that citizens will not see as in some way or another objectionable. I did a lot of work in Burundi, for instance, and in the lead up to the third candidacy of the former president Nkurunziza. You may recall that the police was heavily criticized for very heavy-handed treatment of demonstrators against that presidential aspiration. And of course, this is not at all to excuse police abuses. But nevertheless, it has often seemed to me that they are asked to enforce norms that in some way or another fall far short of what citizens' rights should consist of, and the way that citizens think about a proper and legitimate relationship with the authorities. And of course, this seems to me to be worsened by the pandemic, where the police, of course, is put under the responsibility to enforce norms that the population as a whole doesn't like. Going back to the question of the connections, I have been a great defender about strengthening civil society oversight mechanisms as a way to increase transparency and to improve relations between state institutions, including security institutions, and citizens. It seems to me, however, that there is a very important role for police officers of a corresponding sort, just as civil society needs to gain competencies with respect to security issues. I think that there is a very important role that police forces can play in conversations with the civilian authorities about what their proper role might be. And this requires a different exercise because it is the equivalent of executives devolving power to other branches. It would be an exercise in prudence to say, no, I do not want my mandate enlarged. I would rather get the assistance of other sectors of the state in the performance of this function. But it seems to me that ultimately this is essential. And I would raise as a question to the experts, how much competency is there within police forces that would lead to the exercise of this sort of prudent attitude with respect to their own functions? Sociologically speaking, most institutions like the enlargement of their mandate, promote the enlargement of their budgets, like the exercise of authority, and they almost invariably think that they are in a position to do a good job with respect to them, no matter what is asked of them. That is usually a very bad recipe for enlarging and strengthening trust. So my question is, where is the police in respect to conversations of this sort? And it is a question, not an assertion framed as a question.
Thank you very much. I see Professor Crofts is burning to respond to that. I do have a hand up from Isu. So Isu, could you introduce yourself and pose your question? And then I'll flick to Professor Croft in a response to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. My name is Isu Sichinga from the University of Cape Town Center of Criminology. I'm a student. And so my question goes to, is it Kenny? And so I do understand and maybe also appreciate the fact that Nigeria is doing something in terms of reforming its policing and also institutions of policing by introducing the new Policing Act. And I know one of the talking points that you talked about is that you're looking more towards going to a community policing kind of framework. But the worry that I have is that oftentimes institutions that are not given the proper mandate, whether by constitutions or by the law itself, to carry out the functions of policing, tend to go way beyond the mandate that they might be given at one particular time, and that leads to human rights abuses and so on. So I would like to find out from the discussions that you've been having around your work, what are some of the measures that have been put in place to ensure that non-state actors in Nigeria are held accountable as they take on the role of policing?
Thanks
That's my
very
question.
much. Thanks very much, Isu. So I'm going to hand the floor now to Professor Croft, and then I see Ugi has got a question, and then we'll go back to Kemi to answer Isu's question.
Thanks, Sean. A quick response to Professor de Greef. I'm a public health practitioner. I'm not a police. I have no experience with policing. I've been around police and been working with police for quite a long time. And one observation I would make, which I'm sure is news to nobody, is that there is no such thing as police, in the sense that it is such a variable. In fact, in some ways, it's the most variable profession I've ever met. I often talk about how within policing, I've met some of the most humane, committed people that I've ever met. I've also met some of the biggest neo-liberal fascist thugs, Neanderthal thugs that I've ever met. In the same, not just in the same organisation, in the same agency, as one police officer said to me, sometimes in the same office and often in the same car. So having said that, it's hard to generalise, but through the work that I've been doing and the agencies I've been working with, I've run across an increasing number of police who say, this is not my mandate, this is their mandate. You know, I'll give you a really specific example from your own hometown. I was talking to an officer in the New York Police Department about when they introduced naloxone, police carrying intranasal naloxone for resuscitation of people having suffered an opioid overdose. And I said, how are your members taking it? How are they finding it? And he said, they love it. He said they find somebody who's overdosed for an opioid overdose, and they administer the naloxone, and the person comes back to life. It's like raising them from the dead. They feel so good. And then they say, but when I've done it for the same person for the 6th time, the question comes to me, why? I've done my bit. Where's the health sector? Where's the mental health drug treatment sector coming to pick up? I know of occasions when police agencies have put their foot down and said, we're not dealing with health issues, mental health crisis anymore. It's not our job. Where's the health sector? And I think there's a rule in there, or a generality in there, that while what you say is right, there are police who are involved in overreach, who are involved in taking on things they should not take on. There is also a lot of evidence that the services that should be provided are not there, or they're not there in terms of inequality. From a public health point of view, I would say definitely that inequality is a driver of the things that we're seeing, both ill health and of involvement with criminal justice. And where police are involved in supporting the inequality and the differential response to inequality, often they don't like that. The Dutch police argued in the latest budget round, I hope I've got this right because I know that my friend from the Dutch police is listening. The Dutch police argued in the latest funding round for more resources, not for them, but for the mental health system, because they recognised that the better a mental health system they had, the easier and more effective was their job. I can see my friend is active. So I mean,
wanted to confirm, Nick, you are right. So,
so I mean, the issue is, and we're finding more and more that police are saying that I don't want to be doing this. I'm doing this because there's no one else. And it's true. In a lot of circumstances, the health and welfare services are not there, and that's fine for governments because the people that hurts are the lower classes, the less, the more vulnerable, less powerful. And a criminal justice system is a very good way of cheaply dealing with those issues without having to worry about the underlying causes and without having to worry about complex responses.
Thank you very much, Professor Croft. Ambassador Zvedik?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Thomas, for your questions. I'll just make a very small comment, actually two. One, and I think you know that Professor de Kreef was very right. We have to look at the linkages of many things, and including policing. For example, in Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned, that institutions should be accountable, transparent. Indeed, the question alongside is are these institutions independent? Is police independent? I am afraid to say that in a number of countries it is not. Burundi was one example. We can give many examples of where police became a political instrument of those who are in power to pursue certain selective policies, including crime prevention and crime control. So this is one of the first things that I wanted to say, and which I think is very important. And it applies also to COVID-19 crisis, because we know that responses to COVID-19 crisis in many countries had the political overtones, which is natural. And therefore, even the police role, as our friend was telling us from India, was different from country to country. How they behaved in the lockdown situation in one country was different from how they behaved in another, and how they were perceived by citizens in performing what they were told to do. Right? Second thing that I wanted to say is that regarding Sustainable Development Goals, of course, now we still have some 10 or 9 years to fulfill them, which is a very short period of time. And last year we had the first review of where do we stand, and the results are rather meager. And I'm not talking now about policing, I'm talking about sustainable goals, generally speaking. But there is, and of course, number of these indicators, as Thomas pointed out in his comment and question, are used also for comparative purposes, but many of them are very useful to promote this approach, a more rational approach of evaluation of, in this case, police work, in societies in which such measures are not available. They just don't exist. So we have to look at Sustainable Development Goals, targets and indicators, also as promoting more modern and rational approach in evaluating the behavior of, for example, in this case, police or some other institutions. And I don't know, Sean, if you allow me, I would like to call on Anna just to tell us about the role of civil society in collecting indicators in Sustainable Development Goals, because many of them are not governmental. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'll give you a moment to think about this. I'll hand over to Kemi to come back and respond to Isu's question, and then I'll come through to you. I think it's important to reflect on the role of civil society in this.
Thanks, Sean. And on accountability of non-state actors. I mean, this is something it's been discussed over and over again, and I should quickly state that there have been previous programs supported by the UK government on police and policing reform that has piloted models of community policing framework for engagement in the country, picking different states across the country. And in this pilot I think under the last two programs has involved non-state policing actors. And this is done by the fact that there was an initial mapping that allowed us to look at the different types of the non-state actors in the country, and then you look at the ones that are closer or the ones that are embraced by the community. So for example, if it's a group that works across states, most citizens are not inclined to engaging with them because accountability of such groups is not strong. However, if it is a local structure that works within a community, that it is embedded within the community and it's answerable to the traditional justice system within that community, there is a template of accountability that exists. Such groups are also known to the police, and the police also vet. There has been interventions that has allowed the police to vet the membership, and for there to be a working modality on how they deploy their members to work. And once these members are being deployed to work, they register at the nearest police station. So it's not something that is just being brought in 2020. There have been different ways of piloting and engaging with the different groups, lessons learning that have evolved over time. So there are guidelines that have been formulated. Let me just end there. There are guidelines that have been formulated to regulate membership, to regulate their activities, and determine the scope of how and where they can work. This is what we're building upon here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kemi. Anna, do you want to reflect on the questions raised by Ambassador Shvedi?
Thank you very much. No, yes. Okay. Obviously, this is a topic that I really care a lot about. The Sustainable Development Goals represent a huge opportunity for the data revolution, as it was called at the beginning. So for generating more data to feed these indicators that have been created. In particular, some of the indicators that Ugi has been showing to us, they need data to be collected on the basis of public opinion surveys. So there is a gap in the ability to collect this information that needs to be filled. And now, as far as I know, there is quite a lot of work that is being done to generate these survey instruments that are going to collect the data, comparable and compatible data from all over the world. I don't know how this is going to happen exactly in practice, and how this is going to be handled most probably by the national statistical institutions in each country. But still, this is a way also to involve civil society, because this is public opinion, so it is the households and the citizens who are going to respond to these surveys. In general, the SDGs and civil society is a dialogue that is with ups and downs. You know, the role of civil society in any UN process is a bit uphill, so it's not really easy. And this is also the work that we are trying to do at the Alliance to help civil society to be heard by the UN process. At the high-level political forum, that is the place where the SDGs are discussed, there is some slightly better access for civil society, but not really much better than in any other debate. And in terms of data, the so-called unofficial data have really to fight to be heard and to be seen. There is an entire initiative that is called the Goal 16 Data Initiative, that is a group of 15 civil society organizations that are collecting data that are not really part of the basket for being considered by the official process, and want to support the analysis of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals by also looking at data collected by civil society. Think, for example, of the example that everybody knows, the Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index, that is not part of the official framework, but it's so obviously a very, very useful tool that can be used by states also to measure progress on 16.5 in particular. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes left on this webinar. I see there has been a question posted in the chat looking at some additional information on the guidelines around community policing in Nigeria. I'd like all our participants to think if they have any final questions in this round. But before we take that and the question on Nigeria, I want to go back to our panelists and pose the question that I posed at the beginning, is that if we look at the work that has been done over the last 10 to 20 years on crime and violence prevention and safety promotion from various quarters such as WHO, UN Crime Congress, the guidelines on crime and violence prevention, and if we had an opportunity to speak to those international entities, is there a need at this point to request, to ask, to appeal for a renewed commitment, a renewed investment in these developmental responses to safety? And what would that be? Are we overthinking it? Are we in the space where we can continue, or do we need to pause and be alert to the potential challenges on the horizon and a scale back on some of those investments in developmental responses that we've seen over the past few years? And if so, what do we need to be asking in terms of trying to shore up the gains that we've made? You might disagree with the question. You might say, well, I think we're fine. We need to work. We know what the issues are. But I would really appreciate your inputs on that. So Professor Croft, let's start with you and put you on the spot. Is there something that you would be asking in terms of some of those dilemmas that you raised around recognizing the role of police in mental health and vice versa, and trying to responsibilize many agencies in that approach?
Oh, Sean, I have trouble with big picture. I'm a little picture person. I think, and I'm not an expert by any means in any of these areas. I think in terms of violence prevention, I do see over and over again the positive gains made by when people change their mindset. I mean, about what violence actually is. It is sobering to realise that the public health world has only seen violence as a public health issue for a very few decades. It really only goes back to the 1980s that violence was recognised as a public health issue. And where public health is dominant in leading prevention efforts against violence, I think we see more success. And I think where police and law enforcement recognise the worth of a public health approach to issues of violence, there are demonstrable successes in lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different parts of the world. I'm not answering your question. I'm sorry, but that's probably the best that I can contribute.
Thank you very much. I have a few comments on that, but our other colleagues, is there anything that you think is important? Ambassador Vivek, and then Professor de Kreef.
Yes, thank you, Sean. I think this is very important issue that you have mentioned, and we have somewhat touched upon it, at least, for me. Sustainable Development Goal as a framework is already, providing developmental perspective. But even if we look at some of the issues that have to do with policing, very much that they are developmental, even if the response to them is not only policing, but above policing is militarization. Let's take migration as an example. I think this is a very good example. Obviously, push-pull towards, migration is developmental issue. And the response to that, what we have found up to now, most of the time, is militarization of migration issue. So either we build the wall or fence, or we just close the borders and leave migrants. I know in my country, in Serbia, we have thousands of migrants because they cannot get into the EU. Hungary has put a fence as we used to have it in the old communist times. But the same instrument is used. And it is a developmental issue. We know why people are leaving countries and coming to Western Europe, US, and Canada. Right? This is a developmental issue par excellence. But the ideology of developmental assistance, which was very strong in 70s, doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. So maybe we have to revive some aspects of this, I call it ideology, but political approach, right? To deal with issues such as migration. Or another one, take corruption, in which we also have police, as a control mechanism. Again, either you look at Transparency International that was mentioned, and you see a big gap between the so-called developing countries and developed countries, in a sense that developing countries are mostly corrupt and developed countries are not. And then you look at the reality where big companies from developed countries are involved in big corruption to get public bids in developing countries. Right? And this is, of course, corruption is a developmental issue as well. So I think that we are at the point where international community will again have to realize that sectoral responses to developmental approaches are not working, and that it will have to come up with a new or more revived models of response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ugi. Professor de Kreef?
Yeah, so I could not agree more with Ambassador Švebić. This was going to be my point and my answer to your question, Sean. We actually have to double down on the expectations about the implementation of actually incipient but nevertheless significant developmental proposals concerning understandings of security. Professor Croft mentioned inequality already. Anna mentioned the civil society indicators and surveys. I think that there are other types of indicators. For example, there's a project here at NYU that measures response times to calls to the police. And then, not surprisingly, there is a big, very strong correlation between rapid response times and the affluence of the neighborhoods from which the calls emerge. So this confirms, of course, that policing should not be considered in isolation from other topics, including topics having to do with distributive justice or with development, whatever name one wants to use to it. But I would say development not just in economistic terms, but development in a broader sense, for which one may appeal to sense, understanding of security, or to a notion of human security. In any case, security, which is one of the things that the police participates in, should not be considered to be simply a policing issue, but a broader institutional issue. And the part of my interest, again, is to, just as one makes, from a human rights perspective, a big push for the competencies of civil society to engage with security forces, I would make a parallel push for increasing the competencies of police forces in order to engage with civilian authorities in discussions about what a sensible division of labor between policing and other sectors can be. But the ultimate point has to be greater integration, the breakdown of silos, because in the end, I think that this is the only way that will work, short of the authoritarian exercise of power, which of course is both indefensible and, in the end, ineffective. So.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, the current crisis around C-19 has certainly exposed those fault lines. And if there was an ask, it would be to reinvest and to reaffirm, to double down, as you say, on what we have learned and what we know are not often the easiest of responses, but they're the responses that carry the most likelihood of sustainability and success. There are a couple of chats that have been posted. Teresa is saying definitely we need to engage on this. Social crime prevention practitioners are often not understood and recognized in terms of the value that they bring, and that this should be affirmed. Margaret has raised an issue around how we engage with private security. Teresa has mentioned the fact that in support of the comments made by Professor de Greef, that human rights institutions can play a much bigger role in terms of accessibility to citizens. Barbara mentions, and I think we'll give an opportunity at the end to talk about the upcoming seminars, but that we will be talking about trauma and public health at our next engagement. And that certainly this is part of an ongoing conversation, which is as multifaceted as the issues that have been raised within this, and that remains. There are responses that Kemi has made regarding the community policing frameworks. Our contact numbers are available in terms of the registration. So if the questions and the contacts that you've made here with colleagues and you want to explore it in a little bit more detail, please feel free to mail me or to the Alliance or to Fixed, and we'll make sure that those questions get forwarded through to the right people and we're able to take that discussion forward. Any final comments before we close up? And I think I will hand over to Anna for a word of thanks. Anna, to put you on the spot. But any final comments from any of the participants or presenters? Please feel free to chip in. Nick?
Just a quick comment on the prevention, the undervaluing of prevention. This is a point where I empathize very much with my law enforcement colleagues, because as a public health practitioner, I am always at the short end of the resource allocation and the recognition of worth compared with my my curative colleagues. It's always far easier to raise money for a children's hospital than it is for a good public health intervention. And I think there's common ground there between the preventionists from the public health side and from the law enforcement side.
Thanks very much for this. Sorry, you have your hand up?
Pablo is asking.
Mm-hmm.
No, just to say, Sean, thank you very much and congratulations, and Diana and the organizers for this conversation. I would suggest having similar conversations with people in the fields that correspond to the areas that we seek to establish links with, because it's very, very important to break the silos and not to speak with the converted. I think that we have a very strong case to make here, but we have to take it out of this community and put it in the context of a broader conversation. And as much as the SDGs seek to do that at the UN level, there is, once again, siloization of SDGs conversations. And I insist, most of these initiatives really take place at the national and not the international level. So congratulations, do more of this, and do more of this with different constituencies. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Professor de Cruyff. Anna, I'm going to hand over to you to close the session and offer a word of thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Barbara also wanted to say something, because she put a couple of comments in the chat, and let's see if she's online. No. But anyway, I think that this recommendation made by Professor de Cruyff is really, for me, it's a dream come true, because when we started this discussion, it was exactly this that we wanted to discuss. So we wanted really to break silos and to make sure that we were not only preaching the converted and talking to each other as usual. So I am really excited about meetings like the one we had today. It was really a great conversation. We are going to have 3 more, seminars, webinars. The last one is a wrap-up, where we really would like to invite all our speakers, if possible, to be there, because it would be great to have the possibility then to reflect on the takeaway points. And it will be quite interesting, because we will really have quite a lot of different backgrounds and constituencies among the speakers for the various webinars. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, the speakers and the participants. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for the time. Enjoy the inauguration and stay safe.